There were 3 articles related to the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848 that I read this week. So the first one was by Mary Chapman and Angela Mills, and it was entitled 80 Years and More, Looking Back at the 19th Amendment. So in this piece, Mary Chapman and Angela Mills discussed the notion of Susan B. Anthony being given credit for the women's suffrage movement. They begin the work by discussing the work of feminist historian Gertrude Stein, which was entitled The Mother of Us All, and how Stein gave Anthony most of the credit for starting the women's suffrage movement. The authors rightly claim that the American women's suffrage movement was a long activist movement headed by multiple leaders, including Anthony, rather than just being her brainchild. The rest of the content of their essay discusses the public memory of the women's rights movement and how other activists like Elizabeth Cady Stanton remembered the movement, specifically in Stanton's book, 80 Years and More Reminiscences. Many of the sources in their piece are books and articles from other scholars, rather than primary sources. One example is an article by Mary Chapman, the same one who wrote the article I'm talking about, called Are Women People? The second article I read to give for this video was called Quakerism, Ministry, Marriage, and Divorce by Thomas Ham. In his piece, Ham explores women's issues in the 19th century, specifically the case of Priscilla Cadwallader. According to Ham, Cadwallader was a gifted Quaker preacher, but her divorce was of more public interest than her evangelizing. There is little in the public record from Cadwallader's preaching or her writings. Her marriage was to a prominent Quaker man was very unhappy, and their divorce shook up the Friends community. It is of interest that there are very little writings from her left, save for a few published letters, as many were destroyed by her husband after their divorce. Interestingly, after their divorce, Cadwallader became involved in the social circle that would start the Seneca Falls movement, including Lucretia Mott and Mary McClintock. Her story is also important because many Quakers, like Martha Coffin Wright, became involved in the women's rights movement. Many of the sources from Ham's piece are secondary sources, written by feminist historians like Judith Woolman. In addition, the few remaining pieces of her writing were used as sources for Ham's article. The last piece I read was more of an informative article than a scholarly piece. This was by a professor named Constance Rinder called All Men and Women Are Created Equal. In this piece, Constance Rinder discusses the daily happenings at the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, which would be useful for a scholar who was trying to give their reader a mental picture of the Seneca Falls Convention and exactly how it occurred over those 3 days. In the piece, she discusses the respective roles of Elizabeth Stanton and Lucretia Mott. It's more of an informative piece meant to be read by the general public. Also, I found that she didn't have any sources included in the article, so that was a bit odd.